morning, and thank you for joining me on the path to liberty. It's Wednesday, December 3rd, 2020. And on this episode, I'm talking about the absolutely insane level of political polarization we're facing today and the incredible damage it's doing to the Constitution and liberty. But there is a way out, and I think regular listeners of this show or viewers of this show, readers of the 10th Amendment Center website probably know what that way out is. So today I'm going to cover some articles talking about this from Hannah Cox over at Fee Foundation for Economic Education. Over here at TAC, I've got Mike Meharry and TJ Martinell. Plus, I've got some quotes and insight from Patrick Henry, James Madison, and George Washington. But before getting to that, first of all, my name is Michael Bolden. We broadcast live every Monday, Wednesday, and Friday at 9:30 a.m. Pacific Time from here in my home office and studio in downtown Los Angeles for the 10th Amendment Center. Our show homepage has everything you need to follow this program. We've got over 2 years of archives, previous episodes. And as you scroll down through that page, I'm starting to categorize it in different sections. So if you want to just hear about the 10th Amendment or the Federal Reserve or asset forfeiture or nullification strategy, things like that, I've got some historical episodes. You can actually just pick and choose which category is best for you, and we've got it all organized a little bit better for you to check that out. And on individual episodes, I include a bunch of links and references for you to read and learn more on your own time. We're also on a ton of platforms, and I like to mention all the other platforms in case we get booted off of one of the big ones like YouTube, Facebook, Twitch, Periscope. We also are on DLive, we're on Brighteon.com, Library, LBRY, Library.tv. We have podcast platforms over on Apple, Spotify, iTunes and Apple, iHeartRadio, TuneIn, Amazon, and the rest. You can find all that at the show homepage. It's 10thamendmentcenter.com/path to liberty, all spelled out, 10thamendmentcenter.com/path to liberty. And while we take another minute or so to allow everyone the time to get notifications on the live platforms to be able to join us, I want to say a quick hello to everyone out in the live chat. I saw that Bob Landry had read probably read the Tom Woods email. I know a number of other people had mentioned it, tomwoods.com. He sends out updates sometimes multiple times a day, but he had sent out today, and I haven't read it yet, actually, not till later in the day, but he had sent out an update that the great Walter E. Williams has passed away, and I wish I had something profound to say about that. I do not. It's just incredibly sad. I read so much from him over the years. We actually got a chance through my great friend Jason Rink to be able to get an interview with him and some quotes about nullification a few years ago. Maybe I should dig that up and pull that out. But anyways, I appreciate you all being here. Bob, Funky Euphemism, Bob Brewer, Liberty Revolutionary, Dixie Strong, Shane Lackey, Justin Morrison, Clay Kent, Patricia Dance, MRGF, Isaiah Carrillo, Tim Martin, Dan Warsaw, Angel Eyes Over Texas, that's cool, Tyler B, DL Neal, good to see you, Liberty Firearms over on Twitch in South Carolina, Setuni W, Walter, Christine, Dan Reed, and Tom Wood says, I'm here, you SOP. That's awesome. Well, Larry, Christine, and everyone else, thank you so much for being here. I apologize if I skipped over you, but I will continue reading through the comments a little bit later on. Please leave them. I read through as many as possible later on in the day, and I reply to as many as possible throughout the day later on. But let's start out. I want to start out with a quote from Patrick Henry. And you've heard me talk about centralization of power. Consolidation is what the founders regularly called it. And here's Patrick Henry in the summer of 1788 at the Virginia Ratifying Convention, June 9th, 1788. And he put it this way: consolidation must end in the destruction of our liberties. Not it could or maybe or might, but consolidation, centralization of power, taking all the states and turning them into one giant beast, one giant blob, as Tom has put over the years. Basically, when all decisions are made in one area over a large nation or a large collection, confederation of states like this, Henry warned us, and he was far from alone, that liberty would absolutely be destroyed. Now, James Madison, I want to jump forward a little bit, in his report of 1800, explaining the Virginia resolutions of 1798 in response to the hated Alien and Sedition Acts, he talked about consolidation here as well. He said to consolidate the states into one sovereignty Nothing more can be wanted than to supersede their respective sovereignties in the cases reserved to them by extending the sovereignty of the United States to all cases of the general welfare, that is to say, to all cases whatever. Now that phrase, and it's in italics, all cases whatever. I don't know what Madison's motivation was in putting that, but I suspect it was a tip of the hat to, I guess, kind of a rallying cry of the years leading up to the American Revolution. And here, for example, in the 1774 Declaration and Resolves of the First Continental Congress, they're literally talking about this centralization of power, this consolidation, unlimited despotism, tyranny. The power to do anything in all cases whatsoever was one of the great complaints that led to the War of Secession from the Empire of Britain. And here's how they started out. Literally the first sentence, October 14, 1774, whereas since the close of the last war, the British Parliament, claiming a power of right to bind the people of America by statute in all cases whatsoever. All cases whatsoever. And again, July 6, 1775, here's John Dickinson and Thomas Jefferson in the Declaration of the Causes and Necessity of Taking Up Arms, why they were fighting already. This is in 1775, a year before the Declaration of Independence. They said, why should we enumerate our injuries in detail? Like, what's the point? Why do we have to list single problems? Because you have this one statute on the books that it doesn't matter. It's like whack-a-mole, basically. If you list one, there's another, and you're always going to claim the power to do more. And this is how they put it. By one statute, it is declared that Parliament can, quote, of right make laws to bind us in all cases whatsoever. What is to defend us against so enormous, so unlimited a power? And I mentioned in the previous show, and I've mentioned many times on this show before, when things weren't going so well in the winter of 1776, December of 1776, when Thomas Paine was writing his American Crisis, he specifically mentioned this again. He's like, look, you can't give up now. No matter how difficult it may seem, no matter how much the odds are against us, they're still claiming the power over us in all cases whatsoever. So the opposition to centralization was pretty universal to consolidation. They recognized that consolidation leads to this type of power. Everyone opposed it. They all recognized it as dangerous to liberty. The only debate that was happening was really over which powers might lead to that kind of consolidation. And Mike Meharry covered this a bit in an article that we published just last month. He put it this way: many Americans misconstrue the ratification debates, assuming those favoring the Constitution, the Federalists — now those terms are all propaganda terms of art, of course, Federalists and Anti-Federalists, but we'll just use those because it's easy to understand. Those favoring the Constitution advocated a strong central government, while opponents wanted a weaker general government. In fact, Mike writes, virtually everyone agreed, at least publicly. We know that Hamilton privately flip-flopped. There were probably many others. Everyone agreed, at least publicly, that the Constitution was intended to create a limited federal authority, leaving most power to the states, or the people of the several states, actually. The actual debate, he writes, revolved around whether the Constitution as written would create such a limited government. The Federalists insisted that it would, while Anti-Federalists expressed deep fear that it would not. And James Madison, again in that report of 1800, he's not validating Meharry. Meharry's actually reiterating what Madison was talking about as well. No one disagreed that consolidation or centralization was bad. It was just, well, aside from Hamilton and probably Morris and a few others. But here's Madison again, in point 3 here. Report of 1800. He says the obvious tendency and inevitable result of a consolidation of the states into one sovereignty would be, and mind you, if we aren't exactly there today, even in law, in practice, we basically are. The federal government assumes the power to do whatever it wants, whenever it wants, until a part of the federal government, the Supreme Court, tells us that the federal government can no longer do that. And that's how most people treat the Constitution. That's how most people treat the power of the federal government today. They assume that it has the power to do whatever it does. Anything Congress passes is assumed to be legal, and you're not allowed to do anything about it except vote the bums out, which never works, never gets the job done, or wait for the Supreme Court to give you permission. But guess what? It's not liberty if it comes with a government permission slip. So again, Madison talks about this tendency of consolidation into one sovereignty. He says would be to transform the Republican system of the United States into a monarchy. It's a point which seems to have been sufficiently decided by the general sentiment of America. He's recognizing that everyone understood and agreed that consolidation was a problem, and too much of it leads to a monarchy, even if it's just in practice. He says in almost every instance of discussion relating to the consolidation in question, its certain tendency to pave the way to monarchy seems not to have been contested. Again, no debate over the problem, just what would lead to that problem. The prospect of such a consolidation has formed the only topic of controversy. And that again was James Madison in the Report of 1800. Now, this whole idea of consolidation certainly was already starting to happen with the Alien and Sedition Acts of 1798. And here's Thomas Jefferson lamenting even further consolidation in a letter to Nathaniel Macon. I believe it was November of 1821. He put it this way: "Our government is now taking so steady a course as to show by what road it will pass to destruction, to wit, by consolidation first." Again, destruction comes from consolidation, centralization of power, and then corruption, its necessary consequence. So if you think about corrupt politicians, corrupt bureaucrats, the corrupt deep state, the reason we have so much of that is because there's too much power. If they don't have power to do anything, then the corruption doesn't impact anybody, and the corrupt people aren't trying to get in positions of power because there is no power for them to wield. Jefferson goes on, he says, "The engine of consolidation will be the federal judiciary," which I've covered in other episodes, "the two other branches, the corrupting and corrupted instrument." And today the U.S. central government, I think it's totally wrong to call it a federal government, is the largest and most powerful government in the history of the world on a number of different fronts. It's not even close. Now, Meharry points that out as well. He says, for all practical purposes, he's talking about this all cases whatsoever, really. I mean, he didn't know it, but he was. For all practical purposes, the federal government today operates without any limits at all. Everything the federal government does and approves is considered constitutional. Think about it. They can tell you, they can spend us trillions and trillions of dollars into debt. They can print money at will. They can tell you how you can defend yourself, what you can own, what you consume, what you can put in your body. They can tell you when you have to go off and fight in a foreign land and die for them. They can spy on everything that you do. They can tell you what kind of light bulb, how big your toilet is going to be. It's insane, the level of minutia that they claim the power to have control over, and that people are actually excited about, unfortunately, as well. Meharry goes on, he says, even though the founders committed the Constitution to parchment. Now, we know that Madison himself in Federalist 48 referred to, and many others, referred to even the best Constitution as, quote, a mere parchment barrier. Words on paper don't enforce themselves, of course. But they still put it there because they felt that would set the line in the sand for the people to resist. As James Iredell put it, the people will resist when there's a usurpation of power. Mike says, judges, politicians, and academics have morphed the meaning of words and changed the character of the supreme law of the land into something that the framers and ratifies would scarcely recognize. Now, I want to go over to Hannah Cox, who wrote this article over at fee.org last month. This is really great, and in fact, this is really the article that inspired me to do this particular episode. It reminded me of a few things written by Mike and TJ and others that I thought would make for an interesting case today. And here's how she put it. This was just published in October. She writes, have you ever marveled at how different we are? Or really contemplated the sheer number of ethnicities, nationalities, religions, cultures, or backgrounds represented in this country? Before even considering political ideologies, our country is filled with people whose lived experiences, beliefs, and customs are radically different. And at the time of the founding, even then, with just a handful of people in comparison today, and the number of states or colonies in comparison today, it still was a wide range of differences. People in Virginia and Massachusetts were totally opposite. So the great friendship between someone like Richard Henry Lee from Virginia and Samuel Adams, they normally wouldn't have been hanging out. But they were great friends because they had great ideas in principle. They were so similar in views that even in a situation where you had a wide range of religious, economic, political, and social viewpoints, this idea of federalism, of decentralization, can allow people to live under basically a big defense umbrella in peace. Now, Hannah goes on. She says, the founders recognized that a big centralized federal government or central government could not adequately represent people from so many different places. They also knew it should not attempt to micromanage the lives of diverse citizens with varying interests, and they thought it was very dangerous to do that. They had lived under something like that. They lived in a situation, as Madison pointed out in that report of 1800, where someone claimed the power over all cases whatsoever. And Madison in Federalist 45, arguing for ratification of the Constitution primarily to a New York audience in early 1788, he says this: the powers delegated by the proposed Constitution to the federal government are few and defined. Those which are to remain in the state governments are numerous and indefinite. And Hannah continues. She reiterates what I've been talking about here. We have this massive government, the largest in the history of the world. Chris Rossini, it was really cool to hear him say it on yesterday's Ron Paul Liberty Report, also pointing out we're talking about the largest government in the history of the planet. And for those of you who want to defeat socialism, you don't defeat socialism by supporting people who run the largest government in the history of the planet. You can't support any of these people. They're totally, I mean, we're talking about 7 to 8 times the national spending of a country like China. And we should be ashamed of ourselves at this point. Anyways, she goes on, and here's the problem we're facing. When another person's vote has the ability to wield enormous power over your life and make sweeping changes in your community, that is going to lead to more than hostility. In fact, it is unsustainable and could eventually lead to the breaking up of our country. And maybe in that situation, it's a positive thing, because if you're talking about people here in California, why should people in California have a say over how people live in, for example, Georgia or South Carolina, or even Nevada or Utah or something like that, and vice versa? But unfortunately, because everyone looks to every problem as a central government solution needed, then no matter what you have, you always have a national problem. And as Tom has put it many times, Tom Woods has put it many times, what we end up with in these elections is really a low-grade civil war every couple of years, where one side is trying to destroy and vanquish the other in order to control the entire federal apparatus. And that can only lead to strife and total destruction. And here's how Hannah put it. She says, in a country where people use the federal government to force their customs, again, we're talking about force and power. We're talking about force outside of the Constitution. We're talking about controlling everyone. Instead of a decentralized federal structure, we have a one-size-fits-all solution for everybody, and then no one is actually happy ever, no matter what you get. So when in a country where people use the federal government to force their customs, religions, and practices on others, a culture war is formed where Americans feel they have to fight and defeat those who are different than themselves just to preserve their way of lives. But there's a better way. There's a better way. People can live their own lives in their own area. No one's telling me, or I'm not aware of it, that somehow the central government in Washington, D.C. has to go over to Portugal and force them to end their decriminalization of the drug war that they had over there. But yet again, you still find people from the conservative end of the spectrum that says that they need to do that to stop California or Colorado. Or people on the left want to do that for their own issues. It's always about using one-size-fits-all solution, not respecting people to live in their own way. Can you imagine if we had this type of a view at Thanksgiving dinner? I mean, how many families have like a totally cohesive political, social, economic viewpoint amongst their family? No, this is where you find a lot of people are saying, oh man, I got to go home for Thanksgiving. There's going to be arguments about politics or economics or whatever. The Federal Reserve would be a cool one. But you imagine if you use this, like anytime anybody disagreed with you, someone came in with a hammer or arrested them or forced them to change their views, forced them to act a certain way you're not allowed to do. No, you vegan, you can't have that. Here, shove a turkey leg in their mouth, something like that. This is just absurd. And if it shouldn't be done on a family level, it shouldn't also be done on a nationwide level where you have such horrible end results coming from it. And that's what Hannah says. Well, not that, but she says this isn't sustainable. We're on a dangerous path. And Americans are right to feel violence, retaliation, or even another civil war of sorts if we don't change course. It has to happen, and it has to happen soon. A return to federalism, she writes, is the only realistic alternative and how we get out of this mess. In fact, it's been the prescription. It's been the path the whole way. The centralization of power, the approach where the federal power is going to force its way on everybody, that's always been the bastardization of what we're supposed to be living under. This is the solution. Now, that doesn't mean federalism only when you support the political outcome. And T.J. Martinell wrote about this a few years ago, April 8th, 2017. America needs a come-to-tenther moment, and soon. And he's recognizing all the problems we're facing with political flip-flopping. People who like the Constitution, which is really, when you're looking in Washington, D.C., and kind of on a national perspective, you see people flip-flop on the 10th Amendment based on who's in power. But the Constitution, the 10th Amendment, none of the text there says, well, this applies as long as your political team is in charge in Washington, D.C., but it's totally different when they're out of power. But that's what we see play out all the time. And TJ writes, although presidents have changed, mind you, this was in 2017, our position remains the same. The Constitution, every issue, every time, no exceptions and no excuses. He says, meanwhile, the tunes sung by both political movements in the country have switched entirely. The right, once advocated for decentralization, is now pushing for greater executive power. Meanwhile, the left, well, not all the way around, but in some situations, we've seen this in the last few years, the left has suddenly come to appreciate, perhaps begrudgingly, the role of nullification as the rightful remedy that people like Thomas Jefferson and James Madison offered to combat federal tyranny. I don't know how many times I heard about a governor citing the 10th Amendment for the first time ever in just the last 6 to 8 months or the last year, or pundits who would actually attack our work saying, well, this is a 10th Amendment issue. But of course, they would never call us for that. But that changes based on which team is in power in Washington, D.C. And TJ writes it this way. He says, some have found this flip-flopping amusing, perhaps ironic. And in a way it is, kind of like, okay, here we go. Erwin Chemerinsky, the dean back at UCI, would attack anything about states or localities resisting federal power when Obama was in office, and all of a sudden he started softening up on that when the next guy comes in. But to them, TJ writes, it's a game played between both sides. When one wins, they just switch talking points just like that, and strategies. In years past, that might have been humorous, but I find no levity in the situation or the prolonged, rampant hypocrisy. It's a game this country can no longer afford to play. It's not sustainable. And I think he's absolutely right on this. I'm just going to read a little bit more because I think it's pretty good. Calls for defending the Constitution, TJ writes, and limited government now fall on deaf ears. And I think they've fallen on deaf ears for quite a while, but even more so. If you got a guy like, let's say, Ted Cruz. Ted Cruz was willing to shut down fake shutdown, kind of shut down the government over funding Obamacare in the previous administration. In the current one, suddenly it wasn't an issue, it didn't come up, and he voted to support some spending bills that included that. And then now all of a sudden things are going to maybe switch again in the next month or so, and he's talking about having too much debt again. We see this back and forth. It's like, okay, these hypocrites, and it's nice and easy to slam on them. I'm not just talking about Cruz, but we can talk about Chuck Schumer and Pelosi and all these other people. That's one side or the other, back and forth and back and forth. And it's good to point out their hypocrisy. But the amount of people that actually do this, the amount of people in the grassroots, everyday people that do the same, is pretty high. It's a lot of it. And this type of call for defending the Constitution, it becomes absurd after some point. He says it falls on deaf ears because Americans who hear it and might have otherwise listened know that those who proclaim it are disingenuous and opportunistic. Adhering to the rule of law is now the trite punchline of an old joke. And TJ sums it up like this. He says, the Constitution is not a political buffet. We don't get to pick and choose which parts of it we will follow and what parts we will ignore because we don't like them. And the time will soon be upon us when Americans of all political stripes must decide whether we are going to accept the Constitution as it is written or reject it entirely, because the pretense of federalism has at last come to an end. I would argue that it has been at an end for quite a long time. We are certainly trying to actually revive support for that. We do a lot of work on this. Of course, you are probably familiar with our State of the Nullification Movement report. We just published that for 2019 and 2020, a 108-page free download at 10thamendmentcenter.com/report, talking about how the 10th Amendment tools, nullification resistance, opting out of federal programs is expanding as a movement. 108 pages. When we started doing this, we literally... Man, when we started actually putting these together, we were basically covering non-binding resolutions and one or two types of legislation. Now we're actually talking about things like gun control and prohibition and surveillance and asset forfeiture and no-knock warrants we're going to be covering in this coming year, resisting the empire and the Federal Reserve. There are so many things that can be done that have to be done, because if we're waiting on the federal government to limit its own power, we're all going to be dead and gone. Well, it's never going to limit its own power. That's really what we have to understand. Power is always corrupting. Power is always reaching for more power. And as Samuel Adams once put it, he says, power is intoxicating. Abigail Adams, she said, power is ever grasping. We know that this is a maxim, that it will always grow. And without resistance, without a line in the sand, it will continue to do that. And as long as people support limiting government only based on having an opposition view, being the party out of power, then that power will always continue to grow as well. Now, here's a warning from George Washington that I think actually fits quite well. And instead of loyalty to these principles, like TJ is talking about, the Constitution, every issue, every time, no exceptions, no excuses, the flip-flopping shows us that most people have a loyalty to party, to factions, as what the founders might have referred to it as. And here, George Washington, in his famous farewell address, we know was originally drafted by James Madison in 1792, reworked by Washington and Hamilton, of all people, in 1796. But under Washington's direction, he talked about factions. And this, I think, was absolutely prophetic. Let me just read it in full here. Maybe I'll interject a little bit. But Washington put it this way, published September 19th, 1796, the alternate domination of one faction over another, sharpened by the spirit of revenge, natural to party dissension, which in different ages and countries has perpetrated the most horrid enormities, is itself a frightful despotism. So just going back and forth, party to party, one side to another, and of course, sharpened by the spirit of revenge. This was pretty prophetic. And it does lead to a frightful despotism in and of itself. He says, but that's not even the worst of it. That's only the starting point when you go that route. And this is the route people have gone for a long time. Washington warned. He says, this leads at length to a more formal and permanent despotism. The disorders and miseries which result gradually incline the minds of men to seek security and repose in the absolute power of an individual. Absolute power, consolidated power, centralization. This drives people, the spirit of faction, this adherence to party over principle, however we want to refer to it, it all has the same end result. It has the spirit of revenge, a frightful despotism, and absolute power of an individual. What Madison was talking about a few years later, basically a monarchy in some sorts. He says, and sooner or later, Washington sums it up, the chief of some prevailing faction, more able or more fortunate than his competitors, turns this disposition to the purposes of his own elevation on the ruins of public liberty. And it really is about exercising power that has never been delegated, centralizing power. One more piece from George Washington before I check the live chat. The spirit of encroachment, he writes, tends to consolidate the powers of all the departments in one, and thus to create whatever the form of government, whether you have a republic or a democracy or a monarchy or whatever, an empire, it doesn't matter the form of government. He says, whatever the form of government, it creates a real despotism. And if that wasn't prophetic, I don't know what was. I understand that we don't really cover a lot of Washington, but I think stuff like this, and he may have been good on some things and terrible on other, but that doesn't matter. This is really, really wise stuff, and we would be smart to start paying attention. And that's basically what TJ was warning us about. He was basically saying in his article, like, look, we got to have a change of heart. Instead of supporting a political team, an individual over another, and just owning one side over the other, we have to start supporting decentralization, federalism, a come-to-10ther moment on every issue, every time, no exceptions and no excuses. Looking back over in the live chat, Salt Laker says, did somebody say buffet? Yeah, I haven't had breakfast either, so I'm pretty into that. Bob Brewer says, might the Constitution actually be a buffet, but the laws it was designed to protect not? I don't know if that goes over my head. Neil Archer points out, you see that in the governors through all this lockdown stuff. Clay Kent says, if anyone can sabotage their own liberty, we the people surely can and have. And I think sometimes people actually have, even when I disagree with people. And first of all, you also have to recognize where I come from. I come from the far, far left in my own thought. And I think in many ways, people that even come from the right really come from the far left, because we were all raised in government-run or government-approved schools. And government taught us that when there was a problem, government was going to come in and protect us. Government was going to come in and fix things. And government was going to come. And some of us actually went much further. So, for example, in my own experience, I remember one of the early airline bailout situations when I was a kid. My first thought, my instinct, as a child, well, maybe a teenager I was, my first instinct was, well, if government's spending money on these airlines, if government's bailing them out, why doesn't government just own them? And I didn't just get that out of nowhere. I learned that from something. I thought that was the logical response. Again, government should not only be spending money, but government should own all the businesses. That's socialism. That's owning the means of production. That's communism. And that was my natural thought coming out of public or government-run schools in the socialist state of Milwaukee, Wisconsin, socialist city-state of Milwaukee, Wisconsin. But that's a lot to fight back at. And I look at people who've gone through this as victims of government education. People oftentimes actually have good motives. When people tell us, oh, I want people to earn more, so I support the federal government forcing a $15 minimum wage on people. Well, it makes sense. I also want people to earn more, but I've also broken free from that government propaganda system that tells me that the only way that people earn more is more government rather than less. And so we have to fight through that. We have to have examples of how freedom and liberty is actually better, but certainly, I don't know. I'm just blasting a bunch of garbage at this point. Patricia Dance says, great broadcast. Love these quotes. I really, really appreciate it. And I'm so grateful for all your support, Patricia. Thank you so much. Neil Archer says, when do people understand that you cannot legislate your freedom at the expense of others? And I think a lot of people are living under fear. And I've often cited John Adams back from when he was good. In 1776, he said, fear is the foundation of most governments. Now, if you know me, I'm going to remove the word most from that, but it's a pretty good quote anyways. And people are afraid. People are afraid that people aren't going to earn enough, so therefore they need government to come in and protect them. People are afraid that without no-knock warrants, crime is going to run rampant. People are afraid that without the Federal Reserve destroying the spending power of the dollar, without being able to print fiat money like crazy, trillions of dollars in spending and debt, we're all going to be living in the street without mandated health care, without a single-payer system. Everyone's going to be sick and dead without fighting endless wars all over the place, country after country, bombing people into oblivion without supporting the destruction of Yemen and hundreds of thousands of people dying there. We're going to have terrorists walking the streets destroying us. This is all based on fear. And Madison, of course, warned us, and I'm going to paraphrase. I just can't remember the exact quote, but he basically said, it's a universal truth that politicians will use fear of foreign danger to control and destroy liberty at home. We also know that Paine told us that the art of war is the art of conquering at home. So this type of thing has been going on. It was recognized for a long time, but people are very fearful. And certainly it becomes more fearful when we've all been trained that the only way something is ever solved is by government intervention, government spending, government theft, government this, government that. And certainly it's going to be a scary situation. And that's why decentralization is the way to go. And if you look at the marijuana example, that's exactly what happened. 10, 15 years ago, if I was in a red state talking about, oh, we've got to legalize this plant, right-wing groups would have run me. Well, they did. Sometimes they really did not like hearing this, but I still told them that. They're like, this is terrible. But over the years, they learned by example that when you legalize a plant that the federal government prohibits, the world doesn't come to an end. And maybe some people get really rich off of it. And the result of that has been a reduction in the opposition from that quarter on this particular issue. Now, why can't we just replicate this? Well, there's a number of reasons why we can't, but we should, we can. We haven't done it so far. I don't know who this we is, but people have not done this yet. But why not replicate the same thing for firearms, for example? Legalize what the federal government is prohibiting and show people over time that an armed society is a safer society, a more polite society, and even for those people who basically want to, for example, defund the police, for example, that you can actually do that when people have a way to defend themselves and their property. So if we actually establish a culture of individual rights, of self-defense, then you don't have to rely on a militarized police to be able to deal with anything and everything. And that militarized police is going to find ways to use its power on stuff it should in the first place. So it's not just dealing with property issues and murder and dangerous violent crimes. It deals with all kinds of other stuff. For example, I pointed out in my episode over the weekend on no-knock warrants, I was citing Connor Boyack's great work at Libertas Institute. And they're talking about how no-knock warrants, 77% of the time, in Utah at least, were only used for nonviolent drug war related issues. Only 6% of them were used for violent situations. So when you give them the power, when you say, well, we got to have them do this for this one issue, they're always going to expand that power into all kinds of other stuff as well. Looking over at the live chat, just going to see if there's anything else that I can quick get to. Bob Brewer says, check out a specific comment. I'll look back at the comments a little bit later. I'm running a little bit long today, but I hope you guys found this interesting. I hope it was educational. I hope it just kind of reiterated that passion for actually turn a blind eye to Washington, D.C. as a solution to anything, whether it's the federal courts, the federal Congress, or the federal executive branch. These imperial power centers are not going to save you. Even if you think something has a good short-term result, in the long run, centralization of power is always dangerous to liberty. As Patrick Henry said, consolidation must end in the destruction of our liberties. Henry, Madison, Jefferson, Dickinson, Washington, they've all been absolutely correct on this front, and it's going to take a different approach on anything and everything, allowing people to live totally differently than we want to live in our own lives, in their own area, their own community, and at least their own state. Again, I hope you enjoyed this episode. If you want to help us spread the word and support the show, you can do a few free and easy things to help us do that. Smash the like button, leave a comment, reviews on Apple, Spotify, whatever podcast I don't think Spotify allows reviews, but Apple, Podbean, and a few others certainly do. All of those things trigger the algorithm of the platform that you watch or listen on, and it tells that platform to show the program to more people. Now, of course, if you really want to get behind us, you can put your financial faith behind our work for as little as $2 a month. That's 10thamendmentcenter.com/members. Again, 10thamendmentcenter.com/members. I really appreciate you spending some of your time with me today. Thank you so much for being here. I hope you have a great day, and I'll see you next time here on the path to liberty.